Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are going to talk about one of the Bible's favorite words, servant, and one of the Bible's best-known sentences, let my people go. Trust me, both belong together. Let's start with the word servant. Of course, almost immediately one associates that word with service to God. That is entirely appropriate. But it does not quite tell the whole story. Here is why. In both Hebrew and Greek, the words for servant, eved in Hebrew and doulos in Greek, respectively mean either servant or slave. How one translates these words will depend on context. If the words are used to describe captives in a military operation, slaves will be the proper translation. After all, no military power captures people to become servants. If one is unlucky enough to be captured in a military campaign, that abduction is going to result in a life of slavery. There will be no pay, no benefits, no expectation of humane treatment, and no rights at all. The most that a slave can hope for is being fed enough, a place to rest or sleep, and the like. No one in their right mind would ever volunteer to be a slave. A servant, on the other hand, has a completely different nuance. Being a servant involves a salary of some sort, even a meager one. Being a servant typically involves a contract between an employer and an employee. Granted, being a servant typically suggests being at the bottom of the pay scale, but it is not slavery. Being a servant may mean that one has to figure out how to pay the bills, but one does not have to worry about being bought or sold, or beaten, or subject to utterly inhumane treatment. Slaves and servants occupy different places in any society. Yet in the ancient world, only one word is used to describe these different phenomena, eved in Hebrew and doulos in Greek, as I mentioned. That makes for interesting interpretations in biblical passages. But this interest transcends how to know when to translate servant or slave. Indeed, the context is seldom so ambiguous that a translator sees this as much of a problem. Arguably, one of the most fascinating uses of eved, the Hebrew word, is found in the Exodus story. No translator will have any difficulty in describing what the Egyptians did to the Hebrews, the Israelites. What they did was called slavery. In fact, the Egyptians wished only for harm for the whole Israelite population. The Egyptian government, represented by its king, the Pharaoh, started out by forcing the Hebrews to build two cities, Pithom and Ramesses. Part of the Egyptian strategy involved reducing the population of a people that it had come to believe was a threat, or would be a threat. However, the Egyptian strategy failed. Making Hebrews build these two cities did nothing to halt their growth. In fact, inexplicably, they continued to grow in numbers. So the Egyptians doubled down on their efforts and made the Hebrews work even harder. Another part of the Egyptian effort involved killing male babies. That plan likewise failed. However, when the Hebrews were dealing with this ultimate threat, in that circumstance, Moses was born. Later on, he would have a decisive role to play in the developing drama. By the way, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 13, when we are told that the Egyptians made the people of Israel serve with rigor, the root from the word slave or servant is used. Rather than translating serve with rigor, as the RSV has it, it should be translated as made them slaves who had to do hard labor. No Israelite would have thought that they were being made to quote-unquote serve. They had become enslaved, pure and simple. As the episode develops, after Moses is saved as a baby and subsequently adopted by the Egyptian king's daughter, things get worse for the Hebrews. This is because once Moses was grown, he took matters into his own hands and murdered an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite. Egyptians could beat Israelites with impunity because they were slaves. But what Moses did made him a marked man. He had no choice but to escape to a place where he could avoid Egyptian prosecution. When he was away, he married a Midianite woman and went to work for his father-in-law. It was in that circumstance that he encountered the Israelite God famously at the burning bush. In that context, the words that are germane to our discussion come to the fore, as well as the famous phrase I mentioned at the outset also comes into play in this setting. At the burning bush, the Israelite God made known that the divine plan was to rescue Israel, God's own people, from Egyptian bondage, that is, Egyptian slavery. That is where the well-known statement is found. Typically, God refers to Israel as my people, as is found in chapter 3, verses 7 and 10. But sometimes the deity refers to Israel with parental metaphors. In that case, Israel is called God's son. Because God is interested in all Israel, it is fair to translate this phrase as God's son and God's daughter. In this instance, the parental metaphor is found. God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and let the king know that Israel is my firstborn son or daughter. The Pharaoh is to be instructed in no uncertain terms to, quote, let my son or let my daughter go. That's in verse 23 of chapter 4 of Exodus. That statement, or its equivalent using the word people, has become memorialized. Let my people or my son or my daughter go. That is the famous phrase that in effect encapsulates the Exodus story. While I would not want to do anything that detracts from that statement from the mouth of God, the statement does not end with the demand to let my people, my son, or my daughter go. The very reason for divine rescue involves the rest of the statement, namely, that my people, that my son, or that my daughter may serve me. That means that Israel is not being rescued without purpose other than the rescue itself. The word serve here, as you might already have guessed, is the same word that is used to indicate Israel's bondage as slaves. In a sense, Israel is being given a choice, either to remain as slaves in Egypt, or to become servants of the God who elected their ancestors and is now about to free them from bondage. Put more starkly, Israel has a choice of masters. They might decide that Egyptian masters are not so bad after all, or they might decide that serving God is a much better choice. When we put the matter in these terms, it seems absurd. Who would opt for Egyptian slavery as opposed to serving the God who had elected them and has rescued them? But the ongoing story suggests that that is not as absurd as it appears. After all, when Israel encounters difficulties in the wilderness, they complain that their life in Egypt, while no bed of roses, was preferable to the misery they were experiencing in the wilderness. That happened when they were desperate to find water, when they ran out of food, and when they did not know what direction to go in the wilderness. More than once they complained to Moses that he had brought the people in the wilderness to die of thirst, or die of hunger, or die of exposure. Egyptian life was incredibly hard, but at least it was life. At least once, the Israelites referred to Egypt as a land flowing with milk and honey, the famous way Canaan, the Promised Land, was usually designated. Deciding whether they wanted to be Egyptian slaves or servants of God turned out to be a more difficult choice than one might have imagined. Eventually, though, some Israelites toughed it out in the wilderness and ended up at the boundary of the Promised Land. Just before they went into that land, however, Moses had something to say. He could not enter himself the Promised Land, so he had to say his piece just prior to entry. In this series of sermons, he outlined what it meant to swap Egyptian slavery for service to God. These sermons are, of course, in the book of Deuteronomy. So, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, Moses told the people to, quote, "Give heed to the statutes and the ordinances that I teach you, and do them, that you may live, and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your ancestors, gives you. You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take from it. You may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." This is the first two verses of chapter 4. Later on, Moses explicates at some length Israel's obligation for service to the Lord in a little more detail. This passage is worth quoting at length. This is now Deuteronomy chapter 6, the first 9 verses. Moses speaking. "Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the ordinances, which the Lord your God commanded me," that is Moses, "to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers and mothers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey." And at this point we get the famous Shema. "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Usually, when Christians hear about these commands, they think in terms of ceremonial practices, things that are no longer germane or pertinent. But many of them, perhaps a majority of them, have to do with the members of the Israelite community doing what is necessary for a life that is ethically positive and spiritually robust. Israel is told all the time to take care of the poor, the widows, the orphan, the weak, the stranger, the neighbor, and the like. Israel was to be a source of blessing to each other and to others too. In short, Israel was to be enslaved by and enslaved to God. That is quite an improvement to being enslaved to the Egyptian government and working fingers to the bones in the Egyptian brickyards. If this sounds strange to Christian ears, keep in mind Jesus' admonition that following him required picking up a cross and imitating him. Is that not an ultimate form of being a slave to God? Go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. And also, if you have a question that you want me to deal with in a subsequent Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.